Hi, Paul, and thanks for coming back on the show.
Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Doing good. I'm glad that you're back on, and it's always good to hear from you. In 2018 and already in 2019, so many cold cases have been cracked using the same DNA through GEDmatch process, and it seems like there's no end in sight. I know you downplay it a bit, but you had a big hand in starting that. And when you see all these cases getting solved and so many families getting answers, how proud does that make you both as an investigator and as a person?
Well, I think, I've definitely paid attention to all these cases, and the tool itself, that investigative genealogy tool. I mean, it's revolutionary. When you take a look at the cases that are being solved, like a case that was close to your heart, April Tinsley. I mean, these are the worst of the worst cases, and they have been unsolved in some instances for many decades, just like the Golden State Killer. I'm very proud that in some ways I broke through the kind of the barrier, if you will, about working with the genealogy community. And I just happened to be lucky enough to find the right person to work with Dr. Barbara Ray Venter. And then I had just a tremendous team, Steve Kramer, Melissa Parasol from the FBI, and Kirk Campbell, and Monica Tchaikovsky, who's the one who actually found D'Angelo in the family tree. These people were just on board. And like I've said before, I'll take credit for pursuing this, and I'll take credit for forming the team. But it really was the team that found D'Angelo. And I think it's the team as a unit that is proud of kind of breaking that barrier down and using this revolutionary tool on probably the biggest case it possibly could be used on, which is now permitting agencies to have the confidence to be able to pursue this tool to solve their other cases. And we are seeing cases that many people probably thought would never be solved get solved. So I have a lot of pride in that. And I hope that, the law enforcement's ability to use this tool continues unabated into the future.
And that's a good segue to my next question, because you mentioned April Tinsley. That's when I think of this whole process, I think of her face, and I think of Janelle Cruz and so many other people that I know their families are getting answers because of this process. And it seems like most people that I talk to on social media, or just people in general that are tired of rapists and murderers going through society without getting caught, it seems like they're mostly all in favor of, law enforcement using DNA through GEDmatch, which, just a quick kudos to Curtis Rogers at GEDmatch for saying flat out that he doesn't plan to change any allowances for law enforcement to use his database. But
good for him. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. And I can't say enough good things about him, but there's some people that are worried about law enforcement, that there's some kind of big brother aspect. And I know just recently a lawmaker in the Baltimore area is exploring a plan to stop law enforcement from using these databases to identify criminals, which is mind-boggling to me. And I wonder how that's going to affect him at election time when people find out he's against rapists and murderers being caught. But what would you say to people or lawmakers like this guy that's trying to stop this? What argument would you make to keep this DNA use through GEDmatch, for example, in force?
Well, I most certainly understand why people would have concern, because they're hearing law enforcement accessing genetic information, and people are putting this genetic information up to pursue their own genealogy aspects, and they're not wanting to have that available for law enforcement purposes. A lot of this is misperception because, people are looking at it like all of a sudden I am accessing a genealogy database and I am seeing their genetic information and I can understand what genetic predispositions, what medical consequences their genes are causing them. And this technique is so far from that. I, as a law enforcement officer, when I searched this GEDmatch genealogy database, I never had access to anybody's DNA profile in that genealogy database. In order for me to be able to see their genetic information, I need to have access to their DNA profile, and I didn't. So all I could see is that, oh, these people in this database share a percentage of their DNA with the person I'm looking for. They're a distant relative. Of course, when we search these databases, we're hoping for the closest relative possible to make our lives easy, a brother, a first cousin. But most of the time, that's not what we're getting. With Golden State Killer, I was dealing with third cousins. These people that were the best matches that we had shared less than 1% of their DNA from the Golden State Killer. These people were never under suspicion. Their families were never implicated. All they were starting data points to start building family trees to determine common ancestors. These family trees, the building of family trees, is using public source information. It's using U.S. Census records, obituaries, headstone information. It is traditional genealogy. Morph, right now, I know your name, I know approximately how old you are, and I know approximately where you reside. With a few keystrokes, I could start building your family tree based on the records that are available online. This is all we're doing. We're just getting that little bit of a point in the right direction by going, oh, these are the people we need to start these family trees with. I know the legislator in Baltimore, Maryland, is concerned about collateral damage. People being implicated because they happen to be a relative of the person we're looking for. And he points to a case in Oregon during the Golden State Killer investigation. I was the one responsible for that Oregon one. In fact, I helped write the warrant that ultimately was discovered by journalists in court documents about this. And the perception of what happened versus the reality is so different. This individual that I ended up wanting DNA from was discovered through YSTR searches from the ysearch.org database. Had nothing to do with the investigative genealogy technology that was used to catch Golden State Killer or the Killer of Tinsley or all these other cases. We went up, we talked to him. He voluntarily gave a sample after regaling us with his war stories from the wars that he served in. He was very cooperative, and we were able to determine that he was so distantly related to the Golden State Killer that it wasn't even worth our time to pursue. So these articles and some of these headlines on, law enforcement just, up in Oregon doing horrible things are misleading in the best terms. And in many ways, they're setting an agenda that some of these journalists are trying to put out there. It had nothing to do with what is being done today from the investigative genealogy standpoint. And when you start talking collateral damage, during the course of the investigative genealogy on the Golden State Killer, we ended up getting DNA from one person besides D'Angelo. Prior to that, using traditional investigative processes, whether we were working tips, we had people calling in saying, I know somebody that looks like one of the composites that was drawn of the East Area Rapists in the 1970s. Or we have women calling saying, my ex-boyfriend or my ex-husband, I think he's the Golden State Killer because of X, Y, and Z. We collected DNA from hundreds of people because of those kinds of tips. Imagine sitting in your room right now and having a detective knocking on your door saying, your name came up in the in the Golden State Killer investigation, I need to talk to you. And, oh, by the way, can I have your DNA sample? That's going to be huge in terms of your life. And at that point, when you voluntarily give your DNA sample, you've just given your DNA to the government. Investigative genealogy, we never took possession of anybody's DNA that were in the database. So it is so different. It is such a less intrusive process than what we do in a traditional investigative tactic. And many things, such as what we commonly do looking at Facebook pages and Instagram accounts and all the social media stuff that's out there, we get so much more information about people's private lives than what we can't get anything, searching GEDmatch and saying, oh, this person has 65 centimorgans shared with the Golden State Killer. That doesn't tell me anything about the person. They're just a starting data point. So that's where people need to really understand what this technique is. The Fourth Amendment is a right, and it's a right against unreasonable searches by the government. There is nothing about the investigative genealogy process that's unreasonable, and that's where we really need to underscore that. And I think on the other front, and this is where politicians really need to take notice, is when you take a look at the cases that are being solved, who are the victims in these cases? It's women and children. So if you're going to ban the use of investigative genealogy in Maryland, you are in essence going to allow a predator to remain on the street to further victimize more women, more children. Some of these women will be sexually assaulted. Some of these women will be killed because you have decided through a misperception that this is too much of an invasion in privacy. As a matter of learning the facts, and people that are potentially going to be victims, particularly these women that are out there, their voices need to be heard because this technique is going to help keep them safe.
And so it comes down to a misconception, a misunderstanding of what's being done and how it's being used by people like this politician.
Well, I think for some people it is. I think some people, no matter what, even if they truly take the time to learn what it is, it doesn't matter. It's still the government having access to genetic information, and they'll never budge. So there's always going to be, anytime you're dealing within this political realm, there's always going to be people who are all for it. There's always going to be people who are all against it. And there's going to be people in the middle ground that will make an intelligent decision. And those are the people that we need to educate to make sure that they understand what's going on and that they can accept, yes, this is reasonable and I want to see it done because it is truly. Not only is it giving answers to victims' families that in some instances, multiple decades have wondered what happened to their wife or girlfriend or child, but it's also going to prevent some of these people from suffering the most horrific type of crime, most horrific type of violence being inflicted on them because a predator was allowed to stay on the street to continue to offend. This technology has the ability to take this guy off the street prior to some of the other traditional technologies and investigative tactics that we've usually employed.
And I think it's mostly important for the people at levels of making laws and changing laws to understand what's going on because they're the ones that can, put a stop to these potentially. And if they don't understand the process, then they're going to be part of the problem.
No, absolutely. You don't want to legislate on perception. You need to legislate on reality. And I do think when you take a look historically, there was the Violence Against Women's Act that had been something that many, many legislators were on board with. And anybody that supported something like that, they've got to support law enforcement's continued use of this investigative genealogy tool because the primary victims that this tool is going to be utilized in their cases is going to be women and then also some of the children cases.
Let's hope that guys like this don't get these laws changed and there's no roadblocks in the way of bringing down some of these rapists and murderers, because with the amount of cold cases in this country, you know, a couple 100,000 cold cases is too many. And when we see every week in the news these cases starting to be solved, I can't imagine someone that wants to be part of standing in the way of that.
No, you know, and that's just it. It's really, you know, I've been on the front lines. I've been out looking at victims that have been horrifically mutilated by these, you know, fantasy motivated predators. You see the impact not only on them as a person, but on their family. And it's the real life aspect. And the decision makers, maybe they've never experienced that. And they're looking at things from a legal perspective or a political perspective that is getting them too detached from reality and what is actually happening to people. And so in many ways, they need to be educated as to the reality of the types of crimes that this tool is being utilized on. It shouldn't be utilized on everything. This is, you know, sort of the last resort tool. We don't want to use it on burglaries and petty thefts. It needs to be your major violent felonies such as sexual assaults, homicides, active public safety aspects. Those types of situations is when this tool should be used. And these legislators need to understand that it is something that is going to make society safer. And we do want to see it governed to a point. We want to see law enforcement using it in the appropriate manner in the appropriate cases. And that's where I give credit to Sacramento DA Anne Marie Schubert. She has started a movement in California where her department created sort of a best practices kind of governing her local law enforcement agencies as to when and how the technique would be used. And I know LA DA as well as San Diego DA have started their own best practices. You know, so we do want to see it governed, but we don't want to see it legislated away.